Hello, my name is Michael Moran, and I would like to welcome you to the first episode of An American Journey, podcast about all things American. Whether you live in America and are trying to make sense of it, or merely have a fascination for the USA, this is a podcast for you. We're going to attempt to explain why America is as it is. And to help do that, I'm joined by Julian Bishop, author of the book High, Wide and Handsome.
Hi, Michael. On today's episode, we're going to talk about North Dakota, why vaccinated people no longer have to wear masks, and train versus car.
We'll also be offering two lucky listeners a special surprise at the end, so be sure to listen all the way through for details. In every podcast we do, our plan is to discuss at least one place that each of us have visited in the USA. And this episode today is the state of North Dakota. So, Julian, why did you choose North Dakota for our very first episode?
When we went to North Dakota last year, I was looking at the publicity that the North Dakota tourist industry were using to attract people to North Dakota. And their main phrase was, "Save the best for last," because North Dakota is famously the last state that most Americans visit. And I thought it would be appropriate if we chose it as our first discussion point to counter that rather lame publicity from the Fargo Bureau of Commerce.
Okay, well, I have to confess, Julian, I didn't save the last for the best, so to speak, because when I went through North Dakota, I think I did it in about 15 minutes. We drove in, we drove out to tick off the state on the way to Cody. So when I read your book, I was fascinated to see a couple of things, and in particular, two things that struck me. One, it's got the lowest crime rate. And secondly, it claims to have the world's biggest hockey stick. Do you want to tell me about both for a moment or two?
I didn't actually know it had the US's lowest crime rate. It doesn't surprise me. Most of the states up in that part of the world have pretty low crime rates. Indeed, it's quite hard to get to. You know, if you're going to North Dakota, you really do have to make a special trip. You can really only access it via northern Minnesota, northern Montana, or South Dakota. You've really, in most cases, got to be making a special effort to go there. In terms of the largest hockey stick, the world's largest hockey stick, it's actually the world's largest freestanding hockey stick. The world's largest hockey stick is actually claimed by Canada, who are US's fierce hockey rivals. But they do indeed have the world's largest freestanding hockey stick.
And did you see the world's second largest hockey stick?
No, I didn't, because I didn't take that road. So we had a choice of roads to take. We were travelling from northern Minnesota to northern Montana, and we took the northerly road. And that is the one without any particularly large hockey sticks that I could see. Okay. It travelled mainly through farmland. 90% of the state is farmland. North Dakota is the largest producer of barley, beans, canola, wheat, lentils, oats, all those type of things. And it was easy to see why as we travelled through the state. It's also known, it has 5 Native American reservations. It has a number of military bases. And in the western part of the state, that is the location or the centre of the location of the Bakken oil fields, which hold a quarter of the US's oil in those Bakken oil fields.
Okay. Now, I know you did visit the Prairie Museum, and I think you rated that in one of your top 5 museums, did you not?
After you've sort of taken the classic museums like the Vatican and, you know, those type of museums, which are, you know, rightly regarded as fantastic museums, I would say it was one of the best museums I visited. North Dakota is not a very old state. So in terms of Westerners who've lived in North Dakota, you know, that really started towards the late part of the 19th century. And what they'd done in this museum is they had gathered all sorts of artifacts from about 1880 to about World War II. This huge museum representing, you know, their local history. They had moved whole churches, schools, railways, jails. They had everything there. Every part of life in that prairie living. They had gathered and taken to that museum, and it was fantastic. It was a world-class museum made by people who were amateurs who were celebrating their own heritage.
So how big was this museum?
Well, not very good on sizes, but it was large enough to have 2 schools, a town hall, a railway. So it was probably set on about 3-4 acres, I would have said.
Okay, and have they recreated the prairie as it was then, if they've moved schools? A bit like if I go to around the York Museum, where you can go and walk around the old streets.
The countryside, or the bit where you were walking, was kind of normal, sort of modern walking, with asphalt and some grass. So that hadn't been recreated. But the things in it, they were the original artifacts that were used in, from 1880 onwards.
Okay.
I had an iron lung. They had an iron lung. They had, had all sorts of things which were basically modern history.
And what was the thing that impressed you most then, before we move on?
I just think the whole thing. We all know what a school is like. But, a school 100 years ago, there were some differences from today. I like that. I like the fact that there were things which I could recognise but were slightly different. I love the old cars that they have, but then I like old cars.
Okay. And if that impressed you, I don't think you were that impressed by Watford City. So tell me a bit about Watford City.
So Watford City is one of these relatively new towns which has come to prominence as a result of the discovery of oil in the western part of the state. So oil fields need a lot of labourers to manage all of the oil equipment. And so this new city had been fabricated really in the last 10, 15 years or so. So it was entirely new, was predominantly men, and few of their families had come up. And you could easily see that as the back and field declines, when we use less oil in the future, that this city will become a rather uninteresting ghost town over the next few decades.
And you made reference to the fact that it was going to spoil North Dakota's record of being the lowest crime in terms of crime in the States, given the population of Watford City.
Yeah, well, that's probably right. When you get a lot of people who come in, I think there already was quite a bit of crime in that west part of the state. The usual thing that that type of itinerant workforce bring with them, prostitution, that type of thing. I think they tripled the size of their police force as a result of the new workers that were coming in to work on these oil fields.
And so if any of our listeners are planning a visit to North Dakota, is this a place you must go to? Or is it one of those places, well, if you've got to make some hard decisions, and I'm thinking particularly the attractions in South Dakota and Wyoming nearby, relatively nearby, is it one you must stop at?
North Dakota?
Yeah.
Well, we went to the Theodore Roosevelt National Park, which is in the western part of North Dakota. And it's a park which is divided into 3 units. It was a splendid park. Part of the reason we enjoyed the park so much is that we travelled there at a time of COVID when very few other people were travelling. We went there on a Saturday morning, and for 2 hours we were the only people in the park. So that was a tremendous experience. We saw the bison in the fields. We had the bison walking past us in the car. We took a number of hikes. One of them was to the prairie dogs. Prairie dogs have villages there where we observed these prairie dogs who were running around our feet. So it was absolutely glorious. We were the only people in the park, and it couldn't be bettered, that experience. Whether anyone else would have a similar experience at another time, I don't know. Would I choose if I was from another country and I probably would choose, Wyoming or South Dakota, to be honest. Every part of America has its own attractions. And, we enjoyed our brief 2 days in North Dakota. We thought it was fantastic. So what did you think about your half an hour in North Dakota?
Hard to form a view, to be honest. Hard to form a view. But so what I was going to say, if you like prairie dogs, it's definitely a state for you to go to.
The only other time we had seen prairie dogs was in South Dakota a number of years ago. And we went to a national park there called Badlands. Badlands is the name of a type of prairie, and it's the same type of prairie that we saw in Theodore Roosevelt National Park. And that experience of seeing these creatures was that we were in a very long traffic jam with, 100 of other people who were observing these creatures from their cars. And that was not a great experience. The fact that we were doing it on foot by ourselves, the experiences were incomparable. I didn't enjoy the one in Badlands. I did enjoy the one in North Dakota.
Okay. And we will be returning in future editions to Wyoming and South Dakota as places to visit. In every episode, we're going to try and plan to talk about something that's happened in the news. Julian, I have to ask, how are things in the States when it comes to COVID?
Well, the big news this weekend was that CDC, which is the federal body that advises America on health issues, announced that if you were fully vaccinated, then you didn't need to wear a mask either inside or outside, with a couple of exceptions, hospitals, old people's homes and so forth. So that was a big surprise to everyone. It wasn't, no one was expecting that. As you know, in the US, it's the states which have power over health matters. So each state decides what should be done in relation to COVID. And we have 20 of the 50 states here which have mask mandates, which mean that you have to wear a mask inside and outside. So it's really up to each of those states to determine their own law following this federal advice. And also it's up to each individual private company to decide what they want to do, what their own policies are. So that was, it was very big news. I think it was probably prompted by the fact that vaccination's going very well here. Round about half of adults are fully vaccinated. And about sort of 10% are in process. And there's this rush to try to get to 75% vaccination, because at that point, then you would have reached herd immunity. And so they're looking at this sort of 40% who haven't been vaccinated and trying to encourage them to become vaccinated. And we know from this group that round about 15% potentially might get vaccinated but want to know a little bit more. 6% will get vaccinated if it's required, and then around about 13% have said they will never be vaccinated. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to persuade people to get vaccinated.
Yeah. And before we go on to some very interesting ways of how they've tried to do that, can we just go back to the states that haven't made wearing masks mandatory? And I'm particularly, given it would seem from a statistics perspective, you have an ideal control group and a other group. What's been the impact in terms of hospitalizations or deaths where the states haven't had a mandatory policy? Do you know?
Well, I mean, obviously this is complicated because there are 50 states and there are all sorts of other variables which are going on. But if we take, for example, two states, California and Florida, California, which has had mask mandates and had been locked down fairly tightly, Florida, which has resisted mask mandates and really been open since, for over a year now, they've had similar levels of infection and deaths. Partly, I suspect, because it is actually quite difficult to lock down for a year, expect people to abide by those regulations.
But the inference being, has the wearing of masks had a significant impact on the number of hospital admissions and subsequently deaths?
Yeah, and it's difficult to tell. And obviously, if you're somewhere like Florida, which is a pretty hot place, you can do a lot of your stuff outside. So, we're now in Florida. We were in Florida for a month in December. Pretty much everyone is getting on with their life there, and it's not at all obvious that there's any pandemic. But, of course, people can conduct much of their life outside. If you're in North Dakota, that is very difficult to do during the winter period. You've got to be inside a lot more. So that's what I say. It's a little bit difficult to draw definitive conclusions when there are other variables which may be influencing things. But California and Florida, both of which are generally quite warm places, have similar levels of infections and deaths.
And do you think that in turn has impacted on people's propensity to have a vaccination? You were talking earlier around the desire to get to the 75% herd level immunity. Has it impacted, do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, vaccinations here have been pretty easy to get. So the US, once they had approved the various different vaccines, they've moved pretty quickly. So my wife and I were fully vaccinated by the end of March this year, and our children, who are college-age children, were fully vaccinated last month in April. And if you are 12 years or above, you can get a vaccination pretty easily in the US. If you want a vaccination, it's been pretty easy to get one. There are people who are not sure, and it's this group that they're really focusing on. Vaccinations are the responsibility of each state, and each state is moving forward so that the vaccinations are done much more locally within communities. There's African American community, which is one of the groups which is more vaccine uncertain. They will have community centres and local pharmacies which are carrying out those vaccinations. And then each state is being quite inventive in how they do vaccines. So, for example, one state is paying people $50 if they have a vaccine. Another state, Ohio, if you get a vaccine in Ohio, then you're entered into a lottery, and 4 people who have been vaccinated in Ohio are going to win $1 million. So that's their way of trying to encourage people to become vaccinated.
So by way of contrast, in the UK, by the way, considered to be one of Boris Johnson's big successors, we're way ahead of the curve as opposed to Europe in getting people vaccinated. But we still, if you're under the age of 38, you will not have been vaccinated, not even one jab yet. So clearly, you're ahead of the curve there. There was a big debate a few months ago, a few months ago, it's probably only about 6 weeks ago, as to whether you should have restrictive clauses which allowed only certain people to get vaccines or not. And that debate, I think, was largely won when they said, actually, the important thing here is just to get as many people vaccinated as quickly as possible. So at that point, they just said anyone can have a vaccine. You don't have to be within a particular group. And then you just turned up at a site or you booked a slot if if it was reservable. And then essentially what they did is they got, people like myself, the early adopters, those were the people who got those early vaccines. Okay. And the evidence seemed to suggest you would vaccinate more people if you made it very easy for people to become vaccinated. Yeah. Although again, in Europe, the actual availability of the vaccine has been a major issue. And I understand that's also true in Canada. I was speaking to a client last week who said that there hasn't been this exporting of vaccines, for example, from the States to Canada. So there's significant shortages.
That's right. The US has only today has announced that they will start exporting vaccines to other countries. Mm-hmm. It's been very much, we're going to look after our citizens first. So that's where we are with the vaccines. There is a sort of bizarre party political issue related to vaccines. In general, if you are Democrat, you are more likely to get a vaccine and you're more likely to be willing to wear a mask. If you're a Republican, the opposite is true. One of the groups they're trying to focus on are these Republicans who are less likely to get vaccinated and more likely to spread it because they refuse to wear a mask. They're trying to do things to push that forward with particular demographics. But it is interesting that it's yet another subject that people don't talk about. So if you meet somebody for the first time, you might think it's quite a good conversation starter. Have you had your vaccine yet? But actually, it's really code for, what are your politics? So people tend to avoid the subject of vaccinations when they're meeting somebody for the first time.
That's very interesting because in the UK, you're right. The first thing people ask you today is, have you had your jab? I.e., not you're going to turn it down, but are you on the list to get it? So what are Republican states doing to encourage vaccination, assuming that the leaders of the Republican Party think vaccination is a good idea?
I can't speak for all 50 states, but I think in general, the governors of the Republican states are in favor of vaccinating everyone. They've seen the science and they know that they want to achieve the herd immunity. So, as I say, Ohio has this idea about having a lottery. Another state will pay people if they have a vaccine. Other people, they're just making it easy, because I think for some people, they will have the vaccine if it's very easy for them. So if they happen to go somewhere, happen to be in a pharmacy, you might find the pharmacy says, "Oh, have you had a vaccine?" And the person says no, and they say, "Well, do you want one?" They say, "Okay," and then they give the vaccine there and then. So they're making it very, very easy for people to say yes. And then obviously they're doing the normal things of trying to get people who are representatives of particular groups to say, "I've had the vaccine and I was fine."
And is there a vaccine culture in the States? So, for example, things like measles, or someone told me this week that if you're over 50, you can get a vaccination for shingles.
Well, indeed. And in fact, I went to pick up a prescription for a family member the other day, and they told me that I was eligible for the shingles vaccination. In general, there's a lot of vaccination here. To go to a public school here, typically you have to be vaccinated for all sorts of things. There is different political views on, and then some people are very nervous about the fact that it was approved so quickly. That's the other thing which is making people a little bit nervous. Some people are saying, "I've had COVID, so I don't need the vaccine."
Okay. And from an employment perspective, what way's the wind blowing in terms of making them mandatory in, say, supermarkets or even hospital healthcare?
The CDC, which is the federal body that advises America on health issues, has only advisory power. They don't have any other power. That belongs with the states. So each state has a decision to make now on what they want to do with masks. Each private company also has to decide its own policies. So if you are a company and you've got an office, you have to decide whether you want to ask the people to come back into the office and whether you want to insist that they have a vaccine to come back into the office. And that is a very thorny issue for both states and for private companies. This week, I went into a supermarket here, Publix, one of the large supermarket chains in America, and they had just changed their policy. So previously, they had signs everywhere saying, in order to come here, you have to have a mask. And suddenly, these signs were gone. And they said, no, if you are vaccinated, you can come into our supermarket unmasked. And I had the very pleasurable, as I said earlier, I'm an early adopter, and I had the very pleasurable experience of going into the supermarket maskless. And round about a third of the people in the supermarket did not wear masks, and 2/3 were wearing masks. And it was a very surreal but liberating experience. I felt very liberated doing it. The moment I'm in Key West. Now, Key West is a fairly democratic place, and they have had a very strong message of, you have to wear your masks. I imagine the 2/3 in the supermarket were somewhat conflicted because they've got this advice that if you're vaccinated, you no longer have to wear a mask in a supermarket. What should they do? Should they stop wearing the mask? And for the supermarket themselves, potentially if they say you can come in without a mask, they may alienate some of their customer base. Each company has to make these decisions themselves. And they're going to be early adopting companies which make it quickly and others which do a little bit later.
So it's one to be played out.
It's one that's to be played out. My personal belief is that people would prefer not to wear masks. So I think it will play out relatively quickly. But I was early on this week, I was in another part of Florida. I haven't seen anyone wearing a mask there for the best part of a year, or very few people wearing a mask for the best part of a year. So it's already played out there.
Interesting topic.
Yeah, and I think it's illustrative of the fact that the USA is very devolved. So decisions are not made at the country level. In most cases, they're made at the state level and often made at the county or even the city level. And a lot of people don't understand that about America, but America is a selection of states rather than necessarily one country with one set of policies.
And Julian, I suggested we should talk about cars versus trains because I saw the Oscars this Sunday evening are being presented in the railway station in Los Angeles, which I have been to, which which I have been
Right.
to, and a magnificent building it is too. And interestingly, why I thought cars versus trains, because on each occasion I've been to LA, I've suffered from how come it takes you so long to get around LA? How many cars can get on the freeway? And yet they have a magnificent train system. So, Julian, can you give us a potted history of transportation in the US?
As you know, US is a very large country, and it's got bigger essentially as it's acquired more land across the continental America. Up until about 1849, which was the time of the gold rush in California, it would take about 4 months to get from one side of the states to the other, from the East Coast to the West Coast. And most of that travel was done by waterways. So the very large rivers that we have here, the Missouri, the Columbia, those type of rivers, they were the main way that people got across the country. And they started to build a number of canals to supplement these large waterways. And then, as the 19th century went on, they started to build railroads, trains. But these railroads weren't national, they were really very regional. So these railroads initially were connecting one waterway to another or a waterway to a nearby town. And so what you have in the States is a very large amount of railroad stock. It wasn't designed to be a national transport. It was designed to connect people regionally. And then when the car came into existence, roads were built, but again, they were usually connecting waterways and railroads to nearby towns. So initially, most of those roads were very regional. And then in the 1950s, when Eisenhower was president, he'd been the Allied commander in Europe after World War II, and he'd seen the road network across Germany, and he wanted to repeat that across the whole of the US. So that was when the interstates were introduced, and those interstates are the ones which connect America today. And you have a number of roads which go from east to west and from north to south, and they are very much connecting the whole of America together. Really, I would say the only kind of infrastructure which has been built nationally is the road. Everything else was either natural or it was built only to connect things regionally, which is why you have the situation here today. You were talking about LA, and I've taken LA local transport, and it's I can't say it's great, but it's okay. Places like Atlanta, where I live, it's much less convenient. There is one metro line in Atlanta, effectively one metro line. I think fewer than 4% of Atlantans have ever taken that metro line. So it is so seldom used. It's a very long way away from where I live, and it really only connects certain points in the city, across one line. And if I wanted to use the railroad to go to other cities, I have really basically one choice. I've got one line which goes from New York down to Washington, D.C., through Atlanta into New Orleans. Essentially runs once a day, that journey. And it would take me 12 hours to get to New Orleans by train, but only 7 hours to drive it. I'd have to really love trains to take a train to New Orleans. And if I wanted to go somewhere other than New Orleans, then of course there's no train option. So for me, this question of train versus car, in America, most places, it's obvious you have to take a car or a bus because that is the network, or a plane, obviously. That's the network which is available that enables you to travel.
Okay. And if we take, say, urban congestion, which I presume certainly is a problem in LA, but I think it's a problem in most large American cities, has there not been an impetus to bring in sort of subways as a way of reducing congestion, or is the solution each and every time to build bigger and better roads?
I think from some people have suggested the solution is to build more subways, but the level of investment required is very high. And so the solution always seems to be let's build more roads. And I'll give you an example. In Atlanta, we have regular votes in Atlanta of whether to extend the public transport system. And they're voted on locally. And it's usually something like 70-75% vote against extending public transport. They prefer a solution which makes it easier for them in their car.
Okay. And environmental issues, Julian? Is that going to have an impact on trying to move people? And let's just widen the debate to away from trains, but things like cycles and walking.
Right. Yeah. So those things they're definitely happening in the States. So you see a lot of local initiatives to for cycleways. So they're pretty popular, particularly in the centre of Atlanta. They put a lot of investment into sort of cycle routes and for people to walk safely. So those are happening. They're trying to give people incentives quite decent incentives actually, to ride share. But ultimately, in normal times when people can travel to their office, almost every car only has one person in it. And our high occupancy vehicle lanes here, high occupancy is when you've got more than one person. So 2 people, you get to use a special lane. Most people, there's still a long way to go in terms of people, being more green in the way they travel to and from work. Okay.
I think that's quite a disappointing end to our podcast, Julian, because I was hoping you're going to be more passionate. But I'll relay a story about walking. I took the children on holiday to Universal. And in the resort, I could see that SeaWorld was not a far away, and so I was supposed to wait for the bus. I thought that we would walk, and we were walking. I did notice there was a lack of pavement, so I presume it wasn't being encouraged. And
sidewalks, Michael. Sidewalks.
There was a lack of sidewalks and pavements.
Michael. Pavements are what cars drive on.
Okay.
That's what they call the road. They call that the pavement.
Okay.
The bit you walk on is called a sidewalk.
Okay, then, well, I'll hold to, there were very few sidewalks. And so we're walking along, myself and the 2 children, and then a patrol car came past and asked us what we were doing. And to which I said, I'm walking to SeaWorld. And he said, oh, I don't think you should do that, sir. You're not really, shouldn't be walking, should go bus. He said, but let me give you a lift. And so myself and the 2 kids escorted the police into SeaWorld. So certainly in Orlando, we were big supporters of that police force, a caring police force.
Rather than risk ending on such a negative note, there are a few cities which have a very effective public transport system, but they are kind of notable because you can name them.
The purpose of the podcast is to do something for people who are interested in going and seeing things in the States. So I'm also going to end that I did do a train journey going back to the Central train station in LA. We went on the Pacific Surfliner, I think it's called, down to San Diego, which is very pleasant, and I recommend anyone to do that as opposed to driving down the freeway to do it. It is slow, so you're quite right. There is no such thing as a high-speed train, but it's very pleasant as you go along the coast and gets its name from, you can see lots of people surfing.
Well, that sounds good. And I want to point out that there are a lot of railways in the US. So there are 18 times as many miles of railroad track in the US than there are in the UK. But most of the railroad is used for freight, not for passenger transport. Now, where I live, there are railroad tracks, but those railroad tracks are purely used to transport all sorts of freight from one place to the other.
Yeah, and it's interesting that, for example, Nashville's got a great train station, hotel now, but you can't get off at Nashville. We promised listeners a surprise at the end of the episode. We're going to give away 2 free copies of the audiobook of Julian's book, High, Wide and Handsome, An American Journey. The first 2 people to send a message to Julian via email or any of his social channels will receive a free copy of the audiobook. Please subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts and write a 5-star review. This will help us grow the audience and give us a reason to continue this regular podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it. Back to the start, onto that day. the trains versus cars didn't generate as much as I would like, but I was fine. Yeah.
What would you have liked?
I don't know. It's sort of maybe to highlight sort of train journeys that are worth doing.
Yeah, the problem is I've never taken the train in the US.
I see. Yes, yeah.
What is that noise?
I'm very sorry. That's my printer deciding to do something.
Okay.
I've got it out.
So let me just go back over that when it stopped
Well,
working. So I won't be able to get rid of that.
Yeah.
Get rid of that.
Yeah.
Get rid of that.
Yeah.